We have come to our last character study in this year-long series on lessons from people of faith of the New Testament. And we know him as John. If we had lived in the first century, we would have called him, if we were a Jewish person, Yohanan. If we were a Greek, we would have called him Ioannes. It's always fascinating how names change as you move them from one to the other, but we know him today simply as John. And of course, he was the brother of James. He was the son of Zebedee. He was a fisherman, partners of Peter and Andrew. And he was the one who Jesus loved. I mean, of all the apostles and people around Jesus, he was drawn specifically to John. John is the one in a few moments ago when Craig was talking about being the witness to the spear that pierced Jesus' side and the blood and water coming out. That was John. The name literally means God is gracious. Beautiful, beautiful name. God is gracious. And he was gracious to John. He was the only apostle to evidently die a natural death. All the others were executed at some point in time. But he lived probably up into his 90s, which was incredibly unusual for that time frame. And John is unique in that he's the only apostle or writer of the Gospels who tells us why he's writing. You turn to John chapter 20, and here's what John writes. Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. And I want to call your attention to three words in particular. You've got the word signs, and we're going to talk about why, of all the words that John could have used, he used that word. Why does he refer to Jesus' miracles as signs? And then he focuses on belief. In fact, John's gospel is oftentimes called the gospel of faith because he talks so much about the importance of faith. John 3:16, most of us learned as children, for God so loved the world that whosoever believeth, there it is, that concept of faith. And then John 3:16 ends with the fact that we'll have everlasting life. John is the apostle. In Greek, you have two words for life. You have bios, which we get our word biology from. It simply means life as we have it here on earth. And then you have the word zoe. And zoe is the word that's used for eternal life, the life that God gives. And so you'll find John playing off those two as he goes through his gospel. Now, John begins this gospel mimicking Genesis. In many ways, he's writing Genesis 2.0. He's talking about new creation. He's talking about God sending Jesus to redeem what has been broken from, the earliest chapters of Genesis. Notice John 1, in the beginning. In the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. Through him all things were made. You turn back to Genesis 1, in the beginning, same phrase, God. Of course, the Word is God. Jesus is God incarnate. And through him all things were made and God created. And so you get the exact same concept that you have in Genesis. Another place he plays off of this is in Genesis chapter 2 as creation comes to an end. In one, you have the first day, you have the second day, the third day. Man's created on the sixth day. And then at the beginning of chapter 2, he emphasizes the seventh day. I want you to notice that. By the seventh day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the seventh day, he rested from all of his work. Then God blessed the seventh day. And the reason for that is the number 7 in ancient Hebrew is the number of perfection. It's the number of completeness. Numbers meant something. 6, for instance, is incompletion. That's why when you get over to the book of Revelation, the beast there in Revelation, his number is 666, which is just kind of taking it to an extreme. And so numbers were concepts in the ancient world. We do the same thing today. I mean, think about the number 13. Most people think of the number 13. It's an unlucky number, especially if it falls on what day of the week? Friday. I was born on Friday the 13th. There you go. Numbers mean things. Now, you go back to the text, and again, one of the things John's going to do is he's going to pick up with this concept of signs. And he's going to talk about 7 signs. Going back, grabbing that number 7 out of Genesis 2, he's going to talk about 7 signs. And these signs have a purpose, that we might believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in His name. Now, if you back up just 2 paragraphs, okay, in your Bible, and of course in Greek there's no paragraphs there, you just back up a few lines, you see why John says this about his purpose. Thomas was one of the apostles. The day Jesus is resurrected, 10 of the apostles are together. Thomas is absent. We don't know why. We don't know if he was with family. We don't know if he had gone into hiding after Jesus had been executed. We don't know. Thomas is not there. And later that day, the other 10 finally run into him, and they said, "We have seen Jesus. He's alive." And we all know what we call Thomas. His name is what? Doubting Thomas. Yeah. Now, Thomas was not there. They said, "We've seen the Lord." But he said, "Unless I see the nail marks in His hands and put my finger where the nails were, put my hand into His side, I will not believe." And the Chosen series has done a real good job trying to weave a storyline as to why Thomas may have gotten there. If you've watched The Chosen, you know about that. A week later, they're all together. You need to remember that Passover is followed by the 7 days of unleavened bread. And so Jews who came to Jerusalem were not there for just Passover. They had to stay the whole next week. And so the days of unleavened bread were basically from Sunday to the following Sunday. They're still there observing the days of unleavened bread. Thomas is finally with them. Jesus shows up and says, "Shalom, peace to you." Typical greeting of a Jew at that time. And then he turns to Thomas. "Put your finger here. See my hands? Reach out your hand, put in my side. Stop doubting and believe." And Thomas's response is the first to declare, "My Lord and my God." He finally got it. But Jesus says something about his finally getting it that is so important for us today. Then Jesus says, "Because you've seen me, you've believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." A beatitude of Jesus over you. I don't know if you ever thought about that. If you put your faith in Jesus, not because you saw Him, but because you read about Him, you heard about Him. To use the words of the Apostle Paul, faith comes by hearing, hearing by the Word of God, Romans 10:17. Because you have done that, Jesus says, you're blessed more than Thomas. You're blessed because you didn't have to have literal looking at Jesus' body to put your faith in Him. And so all of us who have become followers of Jesus today are blessed by Jesus. Now, a lot of people call John the book of signs, and it is. We're going to get into that in a second. I call it the Paul Harvey Gospel. And the reason I call it the Paul Harvey Gospel is that Matthew, Mark, and Luke are all very similar. In fact, we call them the synoptic gospel, off the word synonym. They're similar to each other. And they're similar because evidently Mark wrote the first gospel. It was Peter's gospel. Matthew took it and stretched it, made it larger, putting a birth narrative on the beginning, expanding the resurrection narrative. He makes it larger for the Jewish people. Luke comes along, takes Mark's gospel, makes it larger, doing the same thing, except filling in what Matthew had not filled in about the birth narrative and the resurrection narrative. And he wrote his for the Gentiles. John comes along years later, perhaps even having read these gospels. And he recognized that they didn't tell the whole story. Or as Paul Harvey used to say, the rest of the story. And so he tells the rest of the story. And he tells it in the form of signs. He tells it in the form of I am statements. He tells it in so many different ways. And I want us to just look at this book of signs today because I want you to realize that these things are written to strengthen our faith. That's the whole purpose of them. Now, he uses the word signs. Oftentimes in the scripture, you'll find, here's Peter on Pentecost talking about Jesus. He was accredited by God to you by miracles, wonders, and signs. Now, miracles, wonders, and signs, they all refer to the same thing. Jesus doing something out of nature. You know, walking on water, healing a person with leprosy, raising the dead. These are all miracles and wonders and signs. But signs are unique in that they serve primarily to inform someone. We live in a world that we would be lost without signs. I want y'all to think about that. We could go Friday. June and I were in Boston. We went to Boston. Spent 4 days in Boston, then went up to Maine and went all the way up to Acadia National Park. And so we'd never been there. We'd been wanting to do it. So it's one of those bucket list things that we marked off. But we got to Boston, and let me tell you something. Whew. I had to educate myself on the subway system. Now you go down into the subway, and there's signs everywhere. If you want to go here, you want to go there, there were signs everywhere. And June and I did our best to read the signs. Now, we had to get off a couple of subways because we were going the wrong way. All right? I mean, you get on these things, and I'm like, I think we have messed up. And so, we had to get off. And of course, then I rented a car. And I'm thinking, I don't know that I can get out of Boston in a car. I mean, y'all, those people up there, they're different. They are. I mean, you go across the road, you got to look out for bicycles. I mean, people are riding bicycles. And by the way, Jen and I stayed in a part of Boston where everybody was like 40 years younger than we were. Everybody. I mean, we get on the subway and I look around and I'm like, there's no gray-haired people in here. We're it. Just so many college students in that area right across the river from Harvard. And so just a lot of college. But boy, if it hadn't been for the signs, we'd been stuck. I mean, you think about signs. What if yesterday, what if tomorrow all the stop signs in Nashville were taken away? What do you think the day would be like? I mean, can you imagine coming up to an intersection and you're like, okay, who's supposed to stop? And you're like, well, maybe they will. Maybe. I mean, by the way, even with stop signs, right? I mean, it can be a challenge in Middle Tennessee. I mean, stop is such an important sign. Are you going down the road? We were going on Highway 1 up the coast of Maine. And let me tell you, Highway 1 is one of those roads where you got to watch for these signs. Because you come up, you're doing 40, 50 miles an hour, and you got to drop down to 30 real fast. You got a curve coming up. Or what about this one? I mean, have you ever had, like I did the first time I was leaving Freed-Hardman to go back home? I'd been Freed-Hardman a whole week. And June, she and I were dating, and boy, I couldn't wait to get back to Ripley to see her. And I head out of Henderson on 100 Highway, and the next thing I know, I see a police officer waving me over. And I'm like, what have I done? Anybody want to guess? Police zone, school zone. Yeah. I'd never driven or noticed where the schools were. And I'm leaving about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and I didn't see the blinking lights. And boy, I saw the blue lights. I saw those real well. And he pulled over, and I used the preacher card on him. I did. I said, I'm a freshman at Freed-Hardman. I'm becoming a preacher. I've never gone back home this way. I didn't know a school zone was here. I am so sorry. And he said, all right, I'm letting you off this time. Now, just so you know, that card doesn't always work, just so you know. All right. How about this one? We have to, June and I, to go visit our grandkids in Toledo. We oftentimes drive 8 hours. And take my word, when you're driving 8 hours to Toledo, Ohio, those signs become very important. You know where they are. We live in a world of signs. And John knew that. And John said, I want to give you miracle stories, but they're not miracle stories, they're signs, because they're pointing to something. And he's challenging us to look at what they're pointing at. All the way through the gospel. Sometimes he tells us what they're pointing at, but he wants you to see this is to inform you. This is not just a miracle story, but it's about something that's important. The first one is the water to wine. Jesus is starting his ministry. He goes to Cana of Galilee. He gets there. He's been invited. His mother is there, evidently the whole family. He brings his disciples with him. And part of the way through the weddings back then would oftentimes go a week long. They were huge, community events. And part of the way through the wedding, they run out of wine. The biggest no-no you could have. And Mary comes up to Jesus and says they're out of wine. Now, why would she do that? Now, let me just say that in the text, this is going to tell us this is the first of the signs that John's referring to. Now, you need to realize John's picked 7 signs. He's going to tell us the first 2. Here's the first one. Here's the second one. And by then, he thinks you've got it figured out. You can count the rest of them. But the point you need to realize is that we oftentimes look at this and we say, well, here's the first miracle Jesus performed. No, it's the first sign that John identifies. Now, could it have been the first miracle? Perhaps. But here's my question. If it's the first miracle, how did Mary know to come to Jesus? I mean, how would Mary know he could do? He had not done these things when he was a child. He didn't get the power to do that until the Holy Spirit came upon him. And so Mary comes to him and says, they're out of wine. She says, what do you want me to do about it? He says, they're out of wine. He says, my time's not come. It's not ready yet. They're out of wine. And then she turns to the servants, do whatever he tells you. And they fill 6 huge stone jars, each holding 20 to 30 gallons of water. And they fill them with water. And Jesus said, then dip it out. And they carried it to the host of the dinner. This is from The Chosen. I'm using several of those images. And they take it to the host. And of course, he sips the wine and he says, whoa, 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 whoa. Everybody always serves the best wine at the beginning of the wedding. And after you've eaten and you've drunk a while, then they start giving you the lesser wine. But they've saved the best for last. And then John says this. He says, what Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs. In other words, he's giving you 7 signs. Here's the first one he's pointing out, through which he revealed his glory. Now, if you go back to chapter 1, we have seen his glory, John said, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father. Glory becomes an important word in John's gospel. It means that you've seen the divinity of Jesus. And if you look at the text says, and they put their faith in him. But you need to realize something about that. Faith is not a light switch. Faith is not something that you just turn on and then you can turn it off. Faith is a process. And what he's saying here is they began the process of putting their faith in Jesus. Because I don't know about you, but in describing people, I tell people that my faith has never been like this right here. My faith's been more like a roller coaster. Up and down, up and down, up and down. I mean, you have an incident in your life. I had a good friend that I talked to a week ago, and he was talking about he was kind of having a crisis of faith because of something that was going on in his life. And it wasn't that he had lost his faith. It's just that he was struggling with his faith. And I suspect you've done the same thing. I know I have. You move from there over to chapter 4. And by the way, in between these, Nicodemus comes to Jesus and says, by the way, we know you're from God because no one could do the signs you're doing if God was not with him. And so between the first sign and the second sign, you have Nicodemus talking about a bunch of signs. That's why I'm saying these are not the order in which Jesus did miracles. These are just 7 signs that John has picked out. You need to see that. Very important. But the second one is the healing of the royal official's son. Jesus had gone down to Jerusalem. He had left Jerusalem. He'd gone through Samaria. You got the story of the Samaritan woman. And then he had gone all the way up to Cana, back to where he had turned the water to wine. And an official, royal official, this is someone from the Herodian family, had heard that he had come back to Jerusalem, that he was in Canaan. He's in Capernaum, and he heads to Cana. And he does so because his son is sick. He's bad sick. His son is fixing to die. And he comes to Jesus, and he asks Jesus, can you come with me and heal my son? And Jesus said to him instead, go. Your son will live. And look at the next line there. The man took Jesus at his word and departed. And while he was going back to Capernaum, which was several miles away, servants met him and said, your son's okay. He's fine. When did it happen? Yesterday, about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. It's when he was healed. And the man realized that that was exactly when Jesus said, go on back home, your son will live. And look at the last line. So he and his whole household began the journey of faith. The third miracle is the healing of a paralyzed man. Jesus goes to Jerusalem and he goes to the pool of Bethesda. And there at the pool of Bethesda is a man who has been paralyzed for 38 years. I want y'all to think about that. 38 years he's been paralyzed. And at least part of that time, he had stayed at the pool because there was this belief that occasionally an angel would come down, stir the water. First one in the pool would then be healed. And so he was hoping to get healed. But you know how hard it is for a paralyzed man to get into the water when it's stirred? You know, he had never made it. And Jesus came up to him and said, do you want to be healed? He said, if you do, just pick up your mat and go home. He does. Now, the only problem is it was the Sabbath day. And so he's carrying his mat as he's leaving the pool of Bethesda, and all the religious police, we call the Pharisees, are there, and boy, they jump on him. It is the Sabbath. The law forbids you to carry your mat. But he replied, the man who made me well said, pick up your mat and walk. Who is this fella who told you to pick it up and walk? I can see the tone in their voice. I mean, what kind of man would tell you to violate the Sabbath? Now, I want you to look at the story. Here's a man been paralyzed 38 years. He's now healed. And what they're concerned about is him carrying his mat. They're not concerned about the miracle. They're concerned about the supposed violation of the Sabbath day. And what you need to see is that sometimes signs fuel disbelief. Not everyone that sees a sign is going to interpret the sign the right way. And in this case, it hardened them instead of opening their hearts to who Jesus was. And that's the danger of signs. I mean, if you think that, Lord, just show me one sign and that will be enough for me, you need to rethink that. It might be, but it might send you the other direction. The fourth of the signs is the feeding of the 5,000. By the way, the only miracle of Jesus beside the resurrection found in all four Gospels. If you're ever on Jeopardy and it's Final Jeopardy and you're going for everything, and the question is, which miracle of Jesus besides the resurrection is found in all four? You put down feeding of the 5,000. And then you got to give me half of what you win. All right? Only miracle that's found there. And of course, Jesus is right before Passover. It's in the spring, late March, early April, right around our Easter time. And Jesus has gone across because the apostles have been out preaching. They've been out telling people about Jesus. John the Baptist had just been executed. They go over to get some rest. 5,000 men see them get in the boat. They go around the Sea of Galilee. And by the time Jesus gets to the other side, they're waiting for him. So Jesus, after teaching them, feeds them. And it's one of those great stories. I love the way The Chosen depicts it. I mean, Lord, where will we get enough food to feed all these people? And then Jesus says, what do you have? We got 5 loaves, 2 fishes. And they get baskets together, end up with 12 of them packed full when they're finally finished. And they feed 5,000. After the people saw the sign, look at the text. They began to say, surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world. And Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to the mountain by himself. Now, you got to ask yourself what's going on here. Sometimes signs fuel mistaken beliefs. These 5,000 see Jesus perform this sign, and they immediately said, he's the Messiah. He's the son of David. But you need to understand what that meant in their worldview. What that meant in their worldview is he's going to be a literal king in Jerusalem who's going to drive the Romans. He's going to defeat the Roman Empire. That's what's in their minds. And because that is what is in their mind, Jesus recognized they're going to force me to become king. They're fixing to try and do that. Now, they obviously couldn't do that, but Jesus saw them wanting to do that. By the way, who do you think's leading this? Who do you think the they is? Can I tell you who I think the they are? I think the they includes Peter, Andrew, James, John, and Philip, Bartholomew. I think it includes the apostles closest to Jesus. I think they're the ones most passionate about it. They're the ones following him. And as a result of this, Jesus did something very unusual. You have to go to Mark's gospel to pick it up. Jesus sends the apostles away. Literally, the text says he made them get in the boat and leave, which is fascinating. I'm sure they're wondering, why we got to leave? Get in the boat, leave now. He makes them leave. Jesus sends the crowds away, goes up on the mountain and prays, and then in the middle of the night, he goes down and sees the apostles. They're out in a boat. They're trying to row across the Sea of Galilee, except for some strange reason that nobody can figure out why the wind's blowing the wrong direction. Yeah, right. You know, God's making it rough on them. And they're out there and they're rowing and they're not making headway. It's 3 a.m. and Jesus comes walking on the water. And when he gets in the boat, I want you to look at what the text says. They were completely amazed, for they had not understood about the loaves. You see, they had misinterpreted that sign. They thought the sign meant Jesus is a military commander who's now going to deliver us. They were wrong. And because of that, notice what had happened. Their hearts were hardened. You go, why were their hearts hardened? Their hearts were hardened because Jesus made them leave. They'd gotten 5,000 people ready to follow Jesus and do anything Jesus wanted them to do. And what does he do? He sent them all away because they had the wrong idea as to who he was. And so Jesus, to shake them up, goes walking to them on the water. In other words, he's got to shake them out of their bitterness. By the way, I like to refer to this phrase as being they were kind of like a possum is. Y'all ever been around possums? I've been trying to catch a groundhog that we've got in the backyard, and yesterday morning I went out to see if I caught a groundhog, and guess what I caught? Anybody want a possum? He's nice. I mean, he's nice. I go out there and that possum's in the cage and he's sound asleep, and I wake him up, and as soon as I woke him up, he looked at me and went, shh. I mean, I'm like, I'll just leave you there and see what you do when you get a little hungry, you know. But now I open the cage and I let him out. But I like to think that that's kind of the attitude the apostles had. Jesus, how dare you send us away? And so what does Jesus do? Middle of the night, he goes walking across the water. And they see him and they think he's a ghost. They start screaming. And Jesus said, it's I. Now, you go over to Matthew's gospel and you've got Peter walking on the water. John, that's already been written about, so John doesn't talk about Peter's attempt to walk on the water. Instead, what he wants us to realize is how this shakes the apostles up. You see, there was a song that the apostles knew, a song that they would sing in the synagogue. It was a song that they would sing down in Jerusalem. And it comes from the Old Testament songbook. We call it Psalms. And it's Psalm 77. Your path led through the sea, your way through the mighty waters, though your footprints weren't seen. In other words, the psalmist talks of God walking on the water, but he didn't leave any footprints. And by the way, if you've never seen The Chosen does a number of where they literally film from underneath the water as Jesus is walking above them. And you see Jesus' footprints as he's stepping on the water. And of course, as soon as he lifts up a foot, guess what? They go away. He doesn't leave footprints on the water. And of course, the point of the psalm and the point of Jesus walking on the water is to say to the apostles, it's time you put one and one together and see what it equals. And then Jesus opens the eyes of a blind man. He goes to the pool or goes to the temple there in Jerusalem, and he sees a man who's been born blind. The apostles want to know who died that he was born blind. And, Jesus says, neither his parents nor he sinned. This is done to glorify God. He makes mud. He puts them on the man's eyes. The man goes to the pool of Siloam, washes, and comes back seeing. Huge debate erupts among the Pharisees. How did he open your eyes? What did he do to open his eyes? And he goes back to the fact that Jesus did it on the Sabbath day. Violated the Sabbath again. And they cast him as a result of this. They literally cast the healed man out of the synagogue. You can't come back to this synagogue. Get out of here. Jesus finds him and then explains to the crowd what was going on. He says, for judgment I've come into the world so that the blind will see, and those who see, the Pharisees, will become blind. And that leads us to the last and the greatest of the signs, which is the resurrection of Lazarus from the dead. You turn over to John 11. Jesus gets word his friend's sick. He delays. Lazarus dies. He gets there. He's been in the grave 4 days. Jesus weeps when he sees everybody else weeping and everybody heartbroken, and he tells the disciples, roll away the stone. And then he calls out for Lazarus to come forth. And boy, the scene in The Chosen is just precious as people scream and yell and some people start running. I think I'd been among those that would have started running. And yet it's one of the greatest stories in all the Bible. And Jesus, when he meets with Martha before going out to the tomb, he says to Martha, I am the resurrection and the life. I am. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. And then Jesus asked the most important question that any of us could ever be asked that we need to answer. Look at what he says. Do you believe this? Do you believe it? I think at the end of the day, what John wanted to say after writing his gospel was, having read everything that I've written, can you answer this question? Do you believe it? Do you believe the story of Jesus? I tell people that what makes me a Christian is Jesus. It's that simple. It's everything from what he taught to how he lived. It's everything from what he did for you and for me. I mean, how could someone, as Craig reading from Isaiah 53, how could someone take the punishment that was mine and took it upon himself? He did that. And so this morning, I want to extend the invitation in a very simple way. Do you believe this? And if not, what are you waiting for? I mean, don't let these signs turn you away. Don't let these signs lead you in misguided ways. Let these signs do exactly what God meant for them to do. Turn your eyes upon Jesus. Maybe today is the day you go down to the river to be baptized. And if so, we'll help you with that right now as we stand and sing.